English author, educator, and media executive. Margaret Heffernan is joining us, and she has a new book out that's very interesting, very exciting for those of you who haven't read it yet. Margaret's background is she spent a number of years with the BBC, where she wrote, directed, and produced everything from drama and documentaries to music videos. She was the producer of The Doll's House, a prize-winning documentary series about the history of women in the 20th century. And in the 90s, she developed multimedia titles with the likes of Peter Lynch, Tom Peters, Standard & Poor's, and The Learning Company. When the internet came around, she joined CMGI and acted as CEO for a number of their internet properties. And today she's active in academia, serving as Visiting Professor of Entrepreneurship at Simmons College in Boston, as well as an executive in residence at Babson. She's an active blogger and writer working for the Huffington Post, Fast Company, and other magazines worldwide. We're fortunate to have Margaret today to round out our conference and share with us some of her insights, some of which are reflected in her new book, and some of which will be outside of that purview. So please, welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for asking me to finish off what has clearly been a really interesting, complicated, challenging day. I'm speaking here in a number of capacities. The first capacity, I guess, is as an entrepreneur, a technology entrepreneur, who's always been really fascinated by the way that technology can solve problems. I have a deep and abiding belief that it can solve a lot of problems, a lot of deep scars that show the kinds of problems it can't always solve. But a basic belief, that if we understand technology and we understand the problem, we can find ways that the two of them come together. I'm also here in the capacity as an educator. I teach in business schools in the US and in the UK, and I feel that in that capacity, I get what I think of as educated product at the end of the assembly line. So by the time they come to me, they've been through school, they've been to college, they've been through graduate school, and I'm either getting them at the end of their MBA programs or several years after their MBA programs when they feel there's still something somewhere that they have to learn. And that gives me a kind of interesting vantage point from which to assess, well, what has this whole assembly line given them, and what has it left them without? And that's the kind of an interesting question, the answers to which can be pretty alarming. I'm also here in the capacity as a parent, somebody who has kids who have been educated both in the US and the UK, and is constantly trying to figure out how you get the best out of those two things, and how do they compare, and what can we learn, and so on. I'm here in the capacity of an employer who has hired kids from the age of 18 to the age of 65, and is constantly fascinated by what are we getting, and what are we not getting. And I'm also here in the capacity as an author. I've spent the last couple of years analyzing, I know this sounds like fun, analyzing a whole string of disasters. So environmental disasters like the poisoning of Libby, Montana, industrial disasters like the Texas City refinery and the BP plant in 2005, looking at the people involved in the banking crisis. And the one thing I have to tell you about all of those disasters is they didn't happen because people hadn't had enough education. In fact, you could argue that there's almost a kind of direct relationship that the bigger the disaster, the more educated the people were. So that ought to give us pause, because what it definitely tells us is the problem here isn't learning per se. Okay? So what I want to do, it seems to me that there are two ways you can wrap up a conference like this. You can try to synthesize everything and tidy it all up so that you can take it away in a beautifully packageable bundle and kind of lodge it in your mind. Or you could just lob a couple of grenades into the audience and see what happens. So I'm going to do the grenade thing. And the first thing I want to say is, Americans are the least educated people in the developed world. By which I mean they have the fewest numbers of hours of schooling when they leave high school. Now I know, we're technologists and we like fancy abstract concepts, I know, but this is a really simple concept. Okay? The American school day is really short and there aren't very many of them. So in the US, a kid in a week will on average get about 32 hours of teaching, if he's lucky. In the UK, that will be 40 to 45. In Denmark, that will be 53. And in Sweden, it will be about 60. So that's a lot of teaching in a month. Furthermore, Americans have, 180 school days a year, and most of the kids in the OECD have 200 to 220. Not only that, but you have this massive school summer vacation, which is what has led to coining the term summer learning loss. In other words, lots of stuff gets forgotten. It's also known as the mental eraser. And it's reckoned that in the summer vacation, 1 to 2 months of learning just vanishes. This is much worse, of course, for poor kids because smart kids get to go to summer camp. But what that means is that by the time all these wonderful American kids have graduated, they have cumulatively at least 1 year less education than their European counterparts. So that's kind of a problem. That's just a quantity problem, which is there's just not enough teaching going on. Okay, so why is that? Well, people will argue, well, it's because America was an agrarian nation and we needed time off to plow the fields and all this jazz. And I know that that's true, it's historically true. And there has been a real resistance to bringing the school year and the working year into any kind of alignment, the sort of thing which, causes enormous pain and suffering to parents who are trying to figure out what to do with all this time when they're working and their kids are not. So that's some of the reason, of course, is historic. But some of it, I think, is cultural also, which is there's a real tentativeness around the idea of teaching children. A sense that they have this, it's what I think of as a sort of Huck Finn mythology, that childhood is this idyllic time of innocence, and it must be preserved, and anytime you want to kind of sneak a little learning in, it's a kind of intrinsically mean and unpleasant thing to do, and you kind of hope the kids don't notice. And the minute they notice, you back off and say, oh, no, it's not really work. It's fun. My son once said to me, he said, Mom, why do they keep telling me math is fun? Math isn't fun. And okay, for some kids I know math is fun, but for a lot of kids, math isn't fun. But what he was objecting to, and he was smart about this, is there's this kind of, let's wrap it all up in cotton wool, let's put a bow on it, let's kind of sneak it in, and maybe without really noticing it, the kids will learn something, but don't tell them they're learning anything because then they will know that they're learning something, and then they'll be annoyed with us. So there's this feeling that learning is work, that work destroys childish innocence, and therefore it needs to be packaged up as entertainment. Everything has to be entertainment. We are entertained all day long, everywhere we go. The problem with this is two things. One is, kids are sponges. They want to learn. They're built to learn. They're designed to learn. That's what young creatures do. They soak up new stuff. Biologically, it's what they're built for. So when you say to a hungry kid, well, you can have a carrot, but only one, because two might hurt, actually what you're doing is you're limiting the development of that appetite. And there's something else that's going on, because you're also saying, it's all going to be fun, and the minute it is fun, well, then you have to stop. Now, nobody in this room would be where they are today if when it stopped being fun, they'd stopped. Right? In your jobs, do you stop when it's not fun? Would you have got anywhere if you'd stopped the minute it wasn't fun? But by packaging up entertainment as fun constantly, what we're teaching children is the implicit lesson that learning has to be fun, and when it's not fun, it's okay to stop. So what we're not teaching them is perseverance. What we're not teaching them is really focused dedication. And I'm sure all of you here are familiar with Carol Dweck's work, looking at fixed mindsets versus developing mindsets. And one of the things that shows us is that the fundamental to learning and growth is the ability to go through that moment where the learning gets difficult and keep going to the moment of accomplishment. But as long as it's all fun, we're not going to get through the painful part. We'll just stop. So I would suggest to you that actually, rather than teaching our children that all learning is fun, what we need to do is give them a lot of it, give them as much of it as they'll take, but also encourage them not to quit when it gets that difficult. Sometimes you have to wait for the oxytocin. There's a third piece to this, which is, and I learned this, this is very disconcerting for a teacher, and especially for a teacher who, I love teaching, and my students tell me I'm a wonderful teacher. But, the hard fact that I have to come to terms with, certainly the students that I teach at the level that I teach, is that they all learn much more from each other than they do from me. And this is universally acknowledged, that children learn more from each other than they do from their teachers. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means you have to think very hard about the social aspects of education. And I hate to disagree with some of the previous speakers, but to my mind, the notion that we can all have a private tutor and we could all sit inside our houses communing with our private tutor, that's some kind of learning, but it isn't what I would call education. We have to learn from each other because we are social animals. And what we're learning at school, the social interaction that we learn at school, is absolutely fundamental. It is the big part of learning, because if we don't learn how to be with each other, we can't really learn anything. Now, one of the things that's very striking about a lot of the teaching that I do is it's with very, very international groups of people. And it's a spectacular opportunity to see just how hard it is for people to live, learn, and work together. So, for example, I teach an MBA class in England at the moment. We have about 80 students on this program. We have about 15 nationalities. And anytime you ask anybody to do teamwork, they all go into their national groupings. So that's fine. So then you create the groups, and to fight against all of these sort of comforting groups, and you slice them into global groups, and then what do you find? They still do it. So they make all the Asians do the finance, right? They ask all the English people to do the graphic design. It's just astonishing. And actually what they're doing by playing the stereotypes is they're neither learning themselves how they're capable of much more than perhaps they know, and neither are they learning and developing the strengths from the other people in the teams. So you have to work really, really hard to make this kind of learning as valuable as it could be. And you have to do that by recognizing at the beginning that actually the students are the teachers, and making sure that they're in a place where they can teach and learn equally and simultaneously. The social part of learning is fundamental. Then, equally, one of the reasons you don't want people being educated in isolation is not just because you don't want them to miss out on that, but it's also because learning isn't a linear process. that actually when I talk to my students about what they've learned in a very random, chaotic kind of way. And they often need from each other and from their teachers things that you don't really notice until they hit a problem that they can't solve. So, one of the difficulties, as I know from building software products myself, is that all interactivity has to be foreseen and planned. But I'm not at all convinced that any of us have figured out how to build an interactive product so sophisticated that it can identify every learning problem, every learning goal. So that's a real challenge. And I'd also say that there's certainly nothing out there at the moment I've seen that is good enough at that. And I'll give you an example of the kind of problem that I mean, because I think it shows how profoundly nonlinear learning is. A couple of years ago at Harvard Business School, they had a huge problem, which is that they found that their students didn't have particularly good diagnostic skills. They were very good at learning. Learning, textbook stuff by rote and so on, and they were pretty good at, memorizing all the body's muscles and bits of bone and so on. But actually, when they looked at a patient, or they looked at slides in a pathology lab, they didn't really know what they were seeing. So what did they do? Well, they did what everybody would do. They did lots and lots of courses in how to diagnose patients, and they made them look at lots of patients, and they made them look at lots of slides, and what was the outcome? No improvement. No improvement. They had learned as much from that learning process, or from that teaching process, as they possibly could. And along comes a woman from a university in Canada, and she says, well, let's try something different. What the heck? We've got nothing to lose. We've tried this linear teaching stuff over and over again. That doesn't work. Let's try something completely different. Let's teach them art history. So, you can imagine the medical students, especially at Harvard, they're really competitive. They're really driven. They've been doing science and nothing but science, for as long as they can remember. And do they want to study art history? Are you out of your mind? This is not what they paid, $100,000 for. But they're made to do art history. And what happens? Well, of course, their diagnostic skills improve. Because what have they been learning? They've been learning how to see. They've been learning how to look. They've got out of the loop of learning the same stuff in the same way from the same materials, and started thinking in a completely different way. And then they started talking to each other about what they're learning. So this very linear, this very social way of learning is incredibly productive, and it's a huge challenge to technology, because of course technology tends to be very linear in its thinking. It's all pretty much decision trees. But learning is much more chaotic than that. One of the things I've done recently with some of my MBA students is it occurred to me at some point, and I know this is really, it was slow on my part, it occurred to me that it was extraordinarily stupid that we were teaching students about business in lecture theaters. The one thing that never happens in a lecture theater is business. Absolutely categorically never. You can get corpses and cut them up and teach medicine in a lecture theater, but you actually can't do business in a lecture theater. So I did this fantastic study tour. I brought a lot of students from the States to England to look at the development of social enterprise in the UK. And most of these students had never been in a factory. Most of them had never been in businesses like this. So this was a great eye-opener. And in addition, we did, they did projects. We did a lot of online teaching. We did a lot of posting of things on bulletin boards. We used pretty much every kind of technology we could get our hands on, so that we had the study trip experience, we had students in different kinds of internships and placements, we had online teaching, and then we had classroom teaching. It was a nightmare to organize. It was a fantastic experience for the students, and it was probably as close to real life as they're ever going to get while also doing an MBA. that kind of extremely messy, overhead-heavy, admin-heavy program was the closest thing to reality we could devise. And I have to say, all the software we used, it was okay, it wasn't great. All the interactivity we could find, it was okay, it wasn't great. But it left me absolutely convinced that the sweet spot from a business perspective and a learning perspective is this intersection between real life, social life, and technology. That it isn't technology alone, it never will be, it never can be, and it shouldn't be. That if you take the social out of learning, you'll take the learning out of learning. But the more you can combine them, and the more you make them mutually dependent, the richer the student experience will be. So I think that's really important, and I would love to see, as an educator and as a technologist, I'd love to see the technology that makes that easier. And people keep telling me it's here, and I have to say, it really isn't. I think we'll look back, years from now at what we're using today and just be amazed that anybody put up with it, personally. So the social is very important. The final comment I'd like to make is this. I get a lot of employees and I get a lot of students who are pretty well informed, which is to say they have a lot of stuff in their heads. A lot of them are pretty motivated. Some of them have learned that everything in life isn't fun and to go through the pain barrier. But what they're really fantastic at, what they have honed over the years, is fantastic second guessing. That's really what they've learned. In medical education, this is officially understood as what they call the hidden curriculum. So they know, and there have been lots of experiments done around this, that a student who comes into medical school tends to be self-selectedly very conservative and very conformist. What they know now is that when they finish their medical training, they are more conservative and more conformist. Before their medical education, if they're asked, would you do something that was against the rules if a physician asked you to, the majority will say yes. More of them will say yes after their training. What they have learned is how the medical hierarchy operates and how to thrive within it. And I would argue, from certainly seeing many of my employees and my students, the fine art of second-guessing your boss and coming up with the right answer is their number one skill. And that's a problem because what that isn't, and what it's not going to become, is critical thinking. And critical thinking is the stuff we most need. Yeah. When I look at any of these disasters that I've studied, whether it's BP, whether it's the banks, what you don't have is a critical mass of people asking critical questions. And this isn't because they don't know that there are questions. It isn't because they don't have the capacity to ask the questions. It's because they don't know how to form the question in a way that doesn't feel terrifying. And it's because they have been given no skills in how to deal with conflict or to negotiate information. And the more people don't know how to do conflict, the less they're willing to try it. But when you think about it, conflict is just thinking. Conflict is just how you figure out where the optimum solution is. And if you can't do conflict, you won't find that solution, even though everybody in the room has the cognitive capacity to do so. Some of you here may be familiar with Roger Martin's work on integrated thinking. I've sat in business schools with Roger, teach this to an audience of blank faces because they have been so well brought up to think either there's a right answer, which is the answer my boss wants me to find, or any thinking has to be binary. It's yes or no, right or wrong, fast or slow, or upside or downside. The binary bind in thinking is fundamentally anti-creative and incredibly unhelpful. And what's really striking is that when you reject it, you find that young employees become incredibly impatient, very anxious, and very nervous. They don't know what to do. They feel very outside their comfort zone and afraid of what will happen. And yet it's when you get beyond the binary that really creative, integrated thinking occurs. It's also the point at which you need a lot of patience. There's a fantastic description, which I refer to in my book, about George Kennan talking about the creation of the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. When he said, many of the people involved in it were in tears of frustration because it was so hard to figure out what to do. But it was only because they kept insisting that it had to achieve so many goals simultaneously, and because they had the patience, the stamina, and the intellectual capacity to keep the conflict going, that they eventually came up with something so brilliant. We have a lot of very, very hard problems to solve in the next 25 years. We have a lot of really hard problems to solve in the next 2 years. And we badly need the kind of integrated critical thinking that doesn't just accept the quick answer or the easy answer or the binary framework for an answer, but has the stamina and capacity to go beyond and find something better. I would argue that when we're thinking about the fantastic challenge that technology offers to education, we need to be very clear what the goal is. And I would just like to leave you with the idea that the goal should be a well-stocked mind with the moral courage to use it. Thank you.
So thank you, Margaret. That was very inspiring. And one of those that kind of gives you shivers. So thank you all for coming. We are through with our program today. We do have about 45 minutes set aside for people to talk and network and enjoy just meeting each other, which I hope you'll take advantage of. If you are not a member of SV Forum, get my grant great, and you're interested, if you want to know about any of our upcoming events, please feel free to stop by. And I'd like to end by, again, thanking Margaret and let you know that her book, which has recently come out, is going to be, there'll be a link on our website starting early next week so that you can link through it to find it if you're interested in learning more about what goes on in that mind there. That's so brilliant. So again, thank you to Margaret, and thanks to all of you, and thank you to our sponsors for